Good afternoon and welcome. I am Feng Hu, Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Washington University. This event is part of a week-long celebration of connection, creativity, and community. We call this the Power of Arts and Sciences Week because a liberal arts education is powerful. Our students graduate with the foundation to pursue a wide array of careers, become global leaders in their fields, and bring positive change to communities near and far. Our supporters embody these ideals as well. Your generosity and dedication to advancing the mission of arts and sciences shapes the success of our students, our faculty, and our research enterprise. One outstanding example of the power of a liberal arts education is today's guest of honor, Susannah Cahalan. She is the author of 2 excellent books, and I have a copy of each right in front of me. Before I introduce Susannah, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Professor Leonard Green. Dr. Green is a professor of both psychology and economics. He is one of the pioneers of behavioral economics, a transdisciplinary field that combines the experimental methodology of psychology with the theoretical constructs of economics. Specifically, he studies choice and decision-making in humans and non-human animals. He also directs undergraduate studies for the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences. Please join me in welcoming Professor Len Green.
Thank you, Dean Hu. To all of you watching, welcome. Our audience is diverse, with participants viewing today from various states, and we welcome all of you here. Many of you likely have participated in numerous webinars, but I would like to quickly review our format. You will hear and see only me and our guest speaker, Susannah Cahalan. Feel free to use the chat function to introduce yourself and to use the Q&A function to submit any questions. We will take several of these questions at the end of our conversation. The webinar is being recorded, and we will share it on the Arts and Sciences and the Alumni Association websites following the event. It's now my pleasure to introduce Susannah Cahalan, an award-winning New York Times-bestselling author, journalist, and public speaker. Susannah grew up in Summit, New Jersey, matriculated at WashU in fall 2003, and graduated, as you see here, in May of 2007 with a major in English literature and a minor in writing. After graduating WashU, she returned back east and was hired by the New York Post as a news reporter. Things were going remarkably well. She won the Silurian Award for Journalistic Excellence in Feature Writing, also an Associated Press Award for Feature Writing, and she appeared in slightly different hair form, as you see here, for a cover story she did on fancy new In Drinks. But things then began to go weird. Sitting calmly at home, suddenly her arms whipped straight out and stiffened like a mummy's. Her eyes rolled back and foam spurted out of her mouth. In addition to seizures, she had terrifying hallucinations and paranoid fixations, symptoms that led to the conclusion that she was psychotic. Indeed, she was. Through good fortune, despite some medical stupidity and arrogance, but then medical insight and intelligence, Susannah was diagnosed with anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis, an acute form of encephalitis, potentially lethal. She wrote about her month of madness in her 2012 memoir, Brain on Fire. which sold over 1 million copies, was made into a Netflix original movie in 2016, starring Chloe Grace Moretz. In her second book, The Great Pretender, published in 2019, Susannah approached the seminal, groundbreaking work of David Rosenhan on being sane in insane places in the same journalistic way she approached her own month of madness. The book investigates this landmark moment in psychiatric history. The Great Pretender made an array of best of lists, including The Guardian, Time Magazine, The London Times, and The Telegraph, and was shortlisted for the 2020 Royal Society Science Book Award. NPR wrote that The Great Pretender, quote, cements Cahalan's place in the ranks of the country's sharpest writers of nonfiction. And Psychology Today named it the book of the decade. She has written for the New York Times, the New York Post, the Atlantic, Elle, the New Scientist, and BBC's Focus, as well as academic journals, The Lancet and Biological Psychiatry. Susannah has appeared on most top national news programs, including Today, Fresh Air, All Things Considered, PBS's Nova. She's been awarded several academic fellowships, most recently Yale University's 2021 Poynter Fellowship in Journalism, Weill Cornell's 2020 Richardson Seminar in the History of Psychiatry, and most recently Columbia University's 2020 Spitzer Memorial Lecture. She's an adjunct lecturer at New York University, teaching a class on narratives in mental health care. She lives in Brooklyn, though soon to be moving back to New Jersey, with her husband, her dog, and their now 2-year-old twins. This, as you can tell, is a little earlier. These are remarkable books by a very special woman whom I'm privileged to welcome back to WashU. I can say without any hesitation or fear of being contradicted that Susannah truly is family. Indeed, she's my first cousin's daughter and thus second cousin to my daughter. I invite you to join me in welcoming back Susannah Cahalan. Susannah, hi there. I'm thrilled to be the one to have this conversation with you.
Oh my gosh, it's a joy. Not only are you my favorite professor, but you're, I would say, up at the top of one of my favorite human beings. So thank you so much. And I have to say, first of all, the dark hair look that I had in my early 20s, not a good look, I would say. I can't believe you found those. I had this feeling while looking at those images that I was like Tom Sawyer attending my own funeral, kind of, but I felt very nice. Thank you so much for that. Amazing.
Well, I thought people would get a kick out of it.
Yes.
I want to break this down into many different segments: pre-WashU, WashU, post-WashU, future. Let's begin sort of briefly with just what brought you to WashU. I mean, obviously it wasn't me, but you know, why did you come here?
I mean, you know, academically, obviously, it's an incredible school. And so, you know, that was the initial draw. But when we came and visited, I was really struck by the warmth of the faculty and the support staff. And, you know, I actually, Len, I don't know if you remember this, but you kind of enabled me to sit in one of the classes there, which was Bible as Literature, which was an incredible class. And I remember just being really impressed, not only by the incredible lecturer, but also by the engagement with the student body. So it was the kind of combination of the academics coupled with these very supportive and what seemed to be kind of loving atmosphere on campus that really drew me there.
I should tell you that Bible as Lit class, the professor didn't allow first-year students to take it, but he did allow you. I think that was sort of predictive of a special future.
And I'm so grateful for that class because it was one of the most remarkable classes I took during my 4 years there.
Well, he was an extraordinary professor. So now, sort of being at WashU, I mean, in what way was your WashU experience important to you?
Oh, I mean, I think in so many ways it kind of established the grounding upon which the rest of my career would grow from. I mean, I really learned how to write at WashU. I didn't know going in that I didn't really know how to craft a proper thesis or really get an essay together. And I kind of realized how much I had to learn my freshman year. And so I had this baseline. And I remember I had a professor freshman year, and then I had her again junior year. And she called me to her office after class and said, I'm amazed by how improved your writing is. So I would say 100% got a really solid education on how to write, but at the same time got a really great kind of opportunity to do research. And that was really, people really kind of pushed you to kind of go to the stacks and do some academic research. And so it gave me the grounding and the confidence to kind of tackle some kind of dig deep into the archives in a way that has been a big part of my career since.
I was going to ask what might be one of your more memorable experiences at WashU, but I'd rather ask a different question. I'd rather ask you to tell us a bit about, as an undergraduate, what clearly would be considered a journalistic coup. And that was you got to interview in jail Michael Devlin, the child kidnapper at the time, still is. And you had, in fact, 2 interviews with him, and you were the only person, and correct me if I'm wrong, you were the only person who, in fact, got into the jail and got an interview with him, as opposed to all the national press and all these journalists. As a WashU student, you pulled this off.
Yeah, that was my senior year, and I had been working at the Post for a few years as an intern, and then basically as an intern during that time. This huge national story broke in the surrounding areas and in the kind of suburbs of St. Louis. And I had this opportunity to try to get information, and so I went to the prison and successfully interviewed the perpetrator, who kind of at that time at that time we weren't as bubbled as we are now. This was national news that kind of took over the psyche. I don't know how many people remember that famous story of Michael Devlin, but Oprah was all over it. Every single national news organization were covering it, and no one, I guess, had thought just to try to talk to him in prison. And so I did that, and it was definitely controversial and got tremendous backlash, but also was a real kind of eye opener about, journalism and ethics and all these questions that I would be interested in later down the line. But I managed, that all happened my senior year, and was a major introduction to the field of journalism, I think, while still as an undergraduate.
Yeah, no, it was an incredible coup. I'm just imagining all those high-paid journalists and news report venues that was sitting there at the jail, not being let in, and there you are, and you get in. I mean, I think
they didn't even think to go to the jail, and so that was a lesson that I learned then, was just kind of trying to think outside of the box, and just like a lot of boots on the ground opportunities to do some reporting, where it's just kind of basic, like, let's go try to talk to the guy, and I don't think anyone had really thought about that. People's sightlines were on the 2 young boys who were kidnapped, but they weren't thinking about the person, because they thought, oh, well, he's in jail. But I had had experiences with trying to interview other people in jail prior to that. And so I knew that just because someone's in jail doesn't mean they can't speak. And so that, I used that opportunity to try to talk to him. And then, beyond all, any sort of my imagination, I never dreamed I would actually get to talk to him, but I did twice.
Until they blocked you.
Yeah, I have to tell you, the kind of strangest memory from that time was walking along the beautiful, bucolic, campus at WashU, and finding out that there were local news reporters from St. Louis trying to find me to interview me. So that was a very uncomfortable moment. I remember that very vividly from that time.
Well, I guess. I mean, there's so much we can talk about your time at WashU, but let me just ask one final question. So, what would you now go back and tell your WashU self? What advice would you give you years past?
I would urge, and I think, a lot of people will probably relate to this, but I would urge myself to be a little bit more fearless, a little bit less careful about the classes I took. I had a major in English literature and a minor in writing. Obviously, writing was very important to me. But I also took all these kind of amazing classes. Like I loved economics, and I almost did an economics minor, but I was scared of math scared me, frankly, especially the level of what people are at WashU. And so there were certain classes that I felt scared because I thought I wasn't going to get an A or whatever, whatever, keep my GPA up, that I kind of avoided some challenging classes that I wish I had taken. So if I were to go back, I would have taken all those classes I was scared of taking, but I really wanted to, because I think to be a well-rounded writer, you have to have a lot of knowledge, and I'm a generalist. So I like to kind of know a little bit about a lot. And so it would be nice to have had, I did take some of those classes, but to just really push myself to go outside that comfort zone a bit.
I noticed you didn't say, oh, I would recommend going back and, of course, taking psychology classes. No, you have to mention economics. Okay, we'll let that slide for now. So let's get to post WashU now, when you went back to the New York area, and you started working at the New York Post. Can you tell us how that happened?
Sorry, I think I might have frozen for a bit, so I missed a little bit. I'm sorry about that. You were frozen on. I didn't hear you say, and then I lost you for a little bit. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, I'm sorry. What I said was I didn't hear you say that you would tell your previous self that, of course, you should be taking much more psychology courses.
Oh, I 100% would. I 100% would. I wish I would take more psychology, more philosophy. That's I would have 100% taken more. And I was too scared to take your class because I know that, you have an amazing reputation, but you're not easy. So I would have taken your class. I don't know if that would have ethically been sound, but I wish I did.
Well, notice my daughter didn't come to WashU, unfortunately. So after WashU, you moved back to New York. And why don't you tell us, sort of how you started working at the New York Post?
So I started at the Post actually when I was still in high school. So I was 17 when I started there. And I, went and got coffee. I got lunch for everyone. I made copies. I actually was, for a period of time, graduated from an intern to a copy kid. They actually called full-grown adults copy kids there. It was a very old school atmosphere. And so from there, bit by bit, I kept coming back every summer. I would come back every break, and they would give me reporting assignments. And I managed not to bungle too many of them. And so they kept giving them to me. And then eventually, after I graduated from WashU, I actually was hired, so the way that tabloid reporters go, and the Times and other broadsheets to some degree do this too. But typically in the daily newspaper, you're either a runner, which means you're a reporter, or you're a rewrite, which means you take what the reporter got and you write it out, right? Some people do both. A lot of people who have beat reporting, like say they work in City Hall, they do both. I actually got a job in the Sunday paper, which allowed me to work for a week on a story. So I actually would write and report, which was very exciting to me. So right out of WashU, I went into doing that. And the kind of lifestyle of a tabloid reporter in New York City is pretty, it's pretty amazing. I mean, one day I would be covering, a murder, and the next day I'd be stalking like Lindsay Lohan in the Hamptons. Like I never knew what my day-to-day would bring. I actually oftentimes would go undercover, went undercover as a stripper. I didn't actually strip, but, and I one time tried to get illegal butt injections in a hotel room. I didn't actually get the butt injections, but life was, it was a pretty stressful in kind of a great way, in a very like high anxiety. It felt like everything felt very high stakes and fraught, but it was also really, really fun and a great group of people. So it was just wild. It was a wild time. I'm
just imagining your mom with you doing all these things. I mean, as a parent, it's like, is this what my daughter's doing?
Yeah. She was definitely had a lot of sleepless nights, that's for sure.
Yeah, I'm sure. So, you majored in English and you minored in writing, but so I'm assuming you always sort of had an interest in writing, but was that interest to be either a journalist as far as writing goes, or a fiction writer? You know, everybody wants to write the great American novel. I don't know how many great American novels one can write.
No, I'm not deluded enough to think I can do fiction. I love reading fiction. And that's why English literature was so wonderful for me, because I got to do that. But I learned early that my talents are more on my reporting side. I think I'm a fine writer, but I think I'm not. I think to be a great fiction writer, your writing has to be really the star. And I think in terms of what I learned very early, and kind of what I'm attracted to, is I love talking to people. I love hearing stories. I love being a storyteller in a way. And I like telling other people's stories, and I like being bound by the truth and by reality. I think I haven't actually even really tried fiction, but I've talked about it, and I've talked to friends who do both. And fiction is so hard because you're not constrained by the same rules. You're not constrained by the same reality. And so the kind of, it's limitless. And for me, I like to color within the lines in a bit, I like to be constrained. So I just kind of knew that I wanted to do something in the world of nonfiction. I think I dreamed that I would write a book. I don't think that I was necessarily, I don't know if I knew that I had the talent to do it, or that it would actually ever happen. But I definitely dreamed about that. And I had written my first book in 4th grade about a functional family, which again, based on truth. So, so I had these dreams, but I think, being a reporter, in that kind of hard scrabble, tabloid stuff, that seemed more attainable to me in a way. And it's more of like a carpentry job. It's like a skill rather than, it's not as much of this kind of lofty, I'm going to write this great American novel. You're like, no, I'm going to cover the streets of New York City. And to me, it felt like I could do it, and even though it was extremely challenging and difficult, but I was definitely drawn to that aspect of writing and reporting and journalism, I think.
That's interesting. There are many people who would say, I want to write fiction because it's limitless. I can write whatever I want. It's interesting to hear sort of the obverse of that there. That's interesting. A lot of people want to write a novel, and then there are others who want to write short stories. I remember Borges, when he spoke at WashU, he said, I never want to write a novel because you just waste words. With a short story, every word is precious. So I like these juxtapositions.
Yeah. I could, in a way, even though I still don't think I could do it, because I think the short story is probably the hardest to do, because you're constrained and you're limitless. But that economy of language always is appealing to me too, very much so. And I think that when you have to do that.
So what advice might you give a young writer?
Well, this is advice I'm stealing from people, and it might seem cliche, but I feel like writing every day, or as often as you can. It's again, we wait for these. We have these ideas of like the muse coming, and hey, I play that game. I light a candle. I have all sorts of. I make this matcha tea. I have this, and I do it less now because I have twins, and so I just take every moment I can to write and just write. But I used to have all these rituals associated with trying to get the muse. But really, the reality is that it's a muscle. It's like carpentry again. You're working away at a subject, and you have to do it a lot to get good at it. And so, if you can do it as much as you can, if you can get paid to do it, great. If you can't, a friend of mine who is now at NBC News, he couldn't find a job, and so he would rewrite the newspaper articles from the day and find a new way to write leads for them. So, of course, that's in a position where you don't have to, you can be doing that. But he was, working another job and doing that. And eventually it paid off because he got to be such a fast rewriter that he's now, kind of very high up. So I think you can, if you can find, let's say 5-10 minutes a day to just write, I think it's key.
Let's now switch to Brain on Fire. So, you had this psychotic breakdown while you were working at the New York Post. Can you just sort of run us through that whole thing and then your recovery?
So this was 2009. I was 24 at the time, and I kind of just hired full time at the Post. And again, life was so kind of absurd in so many ways and strange and exciting that it took me I think it took me a long time to figure out that something was going on internally. But what happened was that, I first had this kind of extended, almost like mono flu-like experience. And then it escalated, and it all escalated at work in the newsroom. Everyone kind of saw it happening, unfolding before their eyes. I would be very manic, and this is in the matter of days, really, within each other. I'd be manic one day, and then I'd be hysterical the next. And sometimes I'd be manic and hysterical in the same day. I started having visions in a way. Like I saw very bright colors. I felt the walls kind of coming in. I was expressing all this to my colleagues, and they had all thought maybe she's having some kind of a nervous breakdown. There was discussions about calling my mother. And then it all culminated one night when I had a seizure, and my boyfriend at the time, who's now my husband, saw that seizure. And luckily that got me into the hospital system. Now, that didn't necessarily lead me to an answer directly. Throughout the course of over a month, I got diagnoses that ranged from bipolar disorder to schizoaffective disorder, which is a combination kind of a features of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. And then eventually, after kind of seeing varied doctors from various backgrounds, I found this one doctor who had experience. He's a neurologist, but he's an epileptologist. And he had dealt with a patient in the past who reminded him of me. And he had, and this young boy who had a seizure disorder had an autoimmune reaction in his brain. And so that prompted him to test me. And he did a brain biopsy, and he did a lumbar puncture. And eventually I was diagnosed with what's called anti-NMDA receptor autoimmune encephalitis. And it really only got a name in 2007. This was 2009 again. And so I was the 217th person in the whole world to get diagnosed with this newly discovered form of brain encephalitis. So autoimmune encephalitis. So that was Brain on Fire. And, the kind of book itself is, kind of a product of trying to make sense of that time, I think, in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Well, why write a book about it?
Yeah. I think there are a few things. I mean, one, the kind of internal tabloid girl in me knew there was a good story. I mean, it was extremely dramatic story. So in some ways I knew there was an interesting element to it, but more than that, I knew that this was a story that needed to be told, because at the time, my doctor who diagnosed me, he estimated that 90% of people who had this condition were misdiagnosed. That probably was an understatement. I would say probably 99% of people who had the illness then, because it's only been kind of named 2 years before, were misdiagnosed. And in fact, there's been a lot of literature that purports to say that the idea of demonic possession, or examples of demonic possession throughout history, could be explained by autoimmune encephalitis. So there was a big incentive just to kind of spread the word about this condition. And then there was also a deep-seated need on my own part to try to figure it out. And I only figure out how I feel about things when I write about them. And I've kept a journal for years for that very reason. And so the book gave me an opportunity to be able to explain it to myself, because I couldn't remember so much of that time.
Remember, you were psychotic here, and so I'm curious about how you go about writing a book, because after all, though it's called a memoir, it's obviously not a memoir. A memoir is where you're writing about at least your perception of things. Whether or not it's true is a separate issue. But here, you're psychotic, you're hallucinating, you're paranoid. If you write about that, you have no credibility whatsoever. So it's an interesting book. And by the way, for those who haven't read it, it also deals not just with your personal thing, it deals with family issues, it deals with medical competence and medical arrogance. There's so many aspects to it that I think maybe one of the major reasons why it's well written, but one of the major reasons why it so captures people's interest.
That's really interesting. I've always wondered, because I will answer your question, but also to that point, when I was trying to sell Brain on Fire. So the way that you sell nonfiction is that you sell it in proposal form. So it's not actually written yet. Whereas in fiction, you typically sell the book. You've written the whole book and then you sell it. Nonfiction, you sell kind of a promise of a book. And so when I was selling my promise of a book, which would be Brain on Fire, I got a lot of pushback from publishers who believed that this was too rare, that it wasn't relatable. Luckily, it found its way into the right hands who really understood it. But the majority of people thought that people wouldn't be able to relate to the story, which ended up not being true. And I think for the very reasons that you just identified. But in terms of your question about how did I put this together, I mean, I really thought of the book as kind of a building of a case, like I was a lawyer. Like this was the best case for what happened during that time. And so the way I built it was I kind of like separated things off into objective truth and subjective truth, even though what I found was that the objective truth often was not objective. But so I would get the medical records, and that kind of was one layer. And then I would talk to the doctors and nurses, and that's another layer. And then I would talk to my family and friends and interview them, and that was another layer. And then there was a journal that I kept before I started any of that, because I knew false memories could occur during this whole thing, and they did. And I have a journal that just kind of chronicles what I remember and the extremely subjective and unreliable parts of that time that I remember. So it was like all of these versions of the truth that I was trying to kind of architect together into the kind of best case for what happened. So that's how I would, and I agree with you completely. I don't actually think of it as a memoir. Memoir is not my favorite genre. Anyway, I don't gravitate towards reading memoir. So I think I wrote this in a way that wasn't like a typical memoir.
This may be an unfair question, and feel free to punt. You don't have to go there, but so what do you think of the movie that they made of your book, which ended, if I recall correctly, the movie ends with the correct diagnosis. It doesn't deal with the recovery and what happened after, but
yeah.
You know.
Okay, well, I've come to terms with the movie. It was a long, and I have to tell you, you've nailed like why I've had some problems with the movie, just because I did feel that there are a few things that it did, especially in the recovery part, which was basically a tiny little montage, and they actually made the illness in the movie physical. They made me have a cane, which I didn't have in real life, and it was almost like this inability for Hollywood to really accept the fact that there are invisible illnesses, and that to be an illness, it has to be something we can see. So I had to actually be, I had to have a cane. And so I really had a problem with that. And there were other parts of the movie that I had a problem with, but overall, it's a fraught thing. I mean, it's a bizarre experience because I recreated a time I don't remember, but it is about me, but it's about a version of me. Is it me? I don't know. I was so psychotic. And so I recreated it for myself. And in that process, created all these false memories of what I think happened, because I don't remember a good deal, but now I do, because I have all these memories that I created. And then they now did an approximation of my approximation of what happened. It's so many different kind of steps away from what actually happened, and so it's very bizarre and it's surreal. And I'm at this point I'm very glad it's out there. It's reached a lot of people. People have connected to it. The critics did not like it, but I think a lot of viewers really connected to it. And I think it went international. In a way that my book hasn't in the same way. So I'm grateful for it. And I think it's helped spread the word about the condition. So I've come to terms with it. But, I think for a lot of writers, it's hard to see your work kind of getting bastardized by the screen in a way.
And, visual medium is different from a written medium, so of course, but I've told you this years ago, but I just want to make it clear to who's ever listening or who reads the book. As far as I'm concerned, Stephen, who's now your husband, but was then your boyfriend, I think he's the hero of this whole episode. But
yeah, and poor Stephen kind of was bizarrely portrayed as ditzy in the movie, like kind of not Stephen at all. So, and he plays the guitar naked. Stephen does not play the guitar naked. I can do it.
So there's Brain on Fire, which is about a personal experience. And now your latest book is The Great Pretender. How did you get from Brain on Fire with your illness to writing The Great Pretender? Sort of why were you interested in the Rosenhan study?
Well, it actually was kind of gifted to me in some ways, because I was on book tour for paperback version of Brain on Fire. And I went out with two researchers who study the NMDA receptor in schizophrenia. And so we were talking and over dinner, and around that time, I had actually visited a psychiatric hospital. At this point, I was doing grand rounds across the country to spread the word about the condition. And I did a grand rounds at a psychiatric hospital in North Carolina. And while I was there presenting on my own case, a doctor came up to me after and said, "There's a woman in here who sounds a lot like you. I heard her story." A couple weeks later, I checked in with the doctor, and she actually had tested positive for the same condition that I had. But there was a huge difference between us. I was misdiagnosed for 1 month, and she was misdiagnosed for 2 years. And unfortunately, I recovered fully, and the doctor said that she would not recover fully and that she would likely live the rest of her child as what they called a permanent child. So that was really difficult to hear, especially, just kind of selfishly. It was this mirror image, is what I kind of call her in The Great Pretender. It's kind of like, this so easily could have been me. And this is so many people right now. So the question of what is the validity behind psychiatric diagnosis and how are we getting this so wrong were really in the forefront of my mind and really plaguing me. And so I was out at this dinner, and one of the researchers, when I was telling them this story, turned to me and said, "Oh, you're like a modern day pseudo patient." And I was, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "Oh, on being sane in insane places." And so that night I read the study in my hotel room. I was in Boston, and it's this incredibly written, kind of very evocative study where 8 people went undercover in psychiatric hospitals around the country, and they all presented with the same auditory hallucinations, thud, empty, hollow. And just based on those symptoms, they were all misdiagnosed with serious mental illness. And it became this kind of black eye to psychiatry when it was published in 1973. And it pointed out just kind of the effect of labeling on the way we view psychiatric diagnosis and the kind of mistreatment of people just because of a psychiatric diagnosis. And all these things really resonated with me. And so that was kind of the beginning of my interest in that study and what would become The Great Pretender.
The opening line of Rosenhan's paper on being sane in insane places, I just think is a brilliant, talk about good writing to draw you in. It's, quote, "If sanity and insanity exist, how shall we know them?" It's just, what a magnificent.
It's Talmudic. It's Talmudic. It's like, it's
really,
Yeah.
It's so, we have so much to talk about on one of these most important papers in the history of psychiatry, and we're running out of time, and it worries me. But could you sort of, by the way, the other reason to read this book is, again, like Brain on Fire, it brings up important questions. It gives the history of journalists going undercover to really find out what's going on. So it's not just about the Rosenhan case, but also about the history of how you go about being an undercover journalist, so to speak, to find out what's really happening. Could you briefly just sort of tell us, okay, so what did you find?
Yeah, it's so hard for me to distill it down because I'm still very conflicted about what I found. But my kind of the reason for doing this was really to ask the question, what is mental illness, and what have we learned about it since 1973? What have we failed to learn about it? And so I wanted to dive into the study, and so I got access to David Rosenhan's unpublished book and his diary entries and his correspondences, and his very close friends and his family cooperated with me. And along the way, I started to find that there were things that did not make sense in the study and that were not adding up. And so the picture that started to emerge was that parts of the study were fabricated, and that perhaps some of the participants in the study did not exist. That's where I kind of come to in the end. So it's a hard place because I'm a fan of the study and actually a fan of the writer, because I got to know him very, very well through his family. He died before I started this, but I got to know him really well through his writing. I felt very connected to him. I respect the paper, and a lot of the conclusions I find are extremely sound and extremely important. But what I found was that the means to get to those ends of those conclusions were not sound, let's say. And one of the kind of the two biggest findings that I uncovered were his medical records, which kind of showed that he didn't just have one symptom, which I said before, that thud, empty, hollow. But in the case of David Rosenhan, he actually said that he was suicidal and other things that would make it more likely to get a misdiagnosis. And then I also found a participant, one of the pseudo patients who participated, who actually his experience inside a psychiatric hospital was very beneficial. It was actually, he described it as a wonderful experience. I discovered that it seems that Rosenhan threw away that person's experience just because it didn't match his thesis, a kind of form of p-hacking, I guess, if you want to say. So it was an uncomfortable place to be, because I did not go into that book with that conclusion in mind. I actually remember when you sell a book on proposal. And my proposal for this book was actually called Committed. It was not called The Great Pretender. And it was supposed to be a pretty straightforward kind of celebration in a way of that study and a kind of update to it. And it turned in over the course of 6 years, and hiring a private investigator and traveling all over the country trying to figure it out, became this kind of mystery and investigation.
I want to get to questions, but I have so many more. But let me just ask one final thing, and then we'll move on to questions. And that is, okay, so what's next?
Oh, so I actually just handed in a proposal again. This is the proposal day. And I'm actually really, really interested in psychedelics right now. So there's this amazing woman in the history of psychedelics who's been kind of forgotten and marginalized. And she was a big part of the kind of revolution at the time in the 1960s and 70s in hallucinogens and psychedelics. And so what I'm doing is I'm kind of reclaiming her story, which is this really interesting mystery as well, but also talking about modern day psychedelic use and the kind of promises and limitations. And so I'm just starting in that. So it will probably change as who knows, but so that's what I'm looking into now.
Oh, but you've just submitted the proposal. So okay. I hope you're asking for a big advance.
Me too.
So, we have a whole slew of questions coming in, and so I want to at least get to some of them. For example, we have, in fact, a WashU psychology student who I think partly you've answered this, so we don't have to deal with this first part on what inspired you to write the book, but wanting to know, and this is from Dory, who I mentioned as a current WashU psychology student, was it emotionally draining to relive your experience? I mean, you can approach it sort of at a distance, but it still is a personal thing. So is that emotionally draining, or was it, as Dory asked, was it therapeutic?
I mean, what a lovely question to ask. And I appreciate that question very much. I think it was both. And I think it started extremely cathartic because it was getting all these answers about this time that I was not only didn't know what happened, but I was actually ashamed of, because I think because of stigma and mental illness, I had psychosis and I behaved in all these very strange and sometimes embarrassing ways that I think I was shameful. So getting this opportunity to take ownership over it in a way was really helpful to moving on. But, I've been talking about this experience that happened to me 8 years ago. No, my God, no, more than 11 years ago, for 11 years. And since my book came out, I recreated it many different times. And I use it as a challenge to kind of do it differently for myself. Like I do a lot of presentations on it. So I try to recreate it in ways for myself. And so it had gotten a bit emotionally draining, and it does take a toll. Like every time I do a talk about the Brain on Fire experience, I kind of feel physically drained afterwards. Even if it's not emotionally drained, I feel it. So it does, I think, it's also just kind of reopening these, and it's not even as if I have open wounds, because I think they're very healed, but there is something about that process of unearthing that past that definitely does take something away, I think during that time. So thank you for asking that. I mean, I feel like I wanted so much to talk about it and spread the word and also engage with other people who had the condition. But there were times when I think I opened myself up too much, and then I had to do a process of kind of closing myself off again, I would say.
We have a question from Dr. Andrea Murray in anthropology, who asks, did you set out to write a full-length memoir, sort of memoir, or did it begin more as a diary and an email exchange, a blog, and that sort of thing?
Well, this was actually a function of working at the Post. So I had, there was a grand rounds on my condition that my doctor, Dr. Najjar, was doing. And a friend of mine who's from the Post, who's a reporter there, came with me to the grand rounds. And while we were watching this, and there's like a piece of my brain, you know, in this big screen, and she said, "You got to write about this." So she was the one who actually prompted it. And I knew on some level I wanted to, but I think I needed someone else to affirm that this was actually interesting to anyone but myself. And so she told my boss about this grand rounds. And when my boss heard, he said, "I think she should write about it." So he called me in, and that was a Tuesday during our pitch meeting, and I had to get it done by that Friday. So I had to just like, and it's so interesting because when you go back to that original article, there are so many mistakes because I had such faulty memory, and I actually created a lot of false memories by putting that article out there because my family members and friends read it, and then they kind of messed their memories up with my false memories. So, but it actually pushed me to get it on the page, and I'm really grateful for that because I think I could have like really spent a long time trying to figure out how I was going to do it and really wallow it in a way, but I had to kind of punch it out. And then I got this onslaught of interest and, you know, desperation really from other people who were misdiagnosed or looking for answers. And so I knew it was a kind of moral imperative to do it, to get it done. And so I wrote the book in a year, which was fast for me. So I think I had this kind of fire lit below me, and I think the Post article really crystallized that for me.
We also have a question from a junior at WashU, Katie McGilvery, and who would like to know a bit more about how you went about the process of writing The Great Pretender. And she asks, did you write while you were doing the research, or did you wait until you had gathered all the information? I mean, I think that's critically important for
Great question.
Students who are planning to write in the future.
I'm going to tell you what you should do and what I did. So I had very, very good advice from a writer named Christopher McDougall, who wrote Born to Run. If you're familiar with that wonderful book, it's a great book. And he got on the phone with me, and I was starting Brain on Fire, actually. Start writing as soon as possible. You're going to fall in love with the research, and you're going to go down these rabbit holes, and you have to start writing as soon as possible. Now, I didn't necessarily take his advice as much as I should have, you know, especially on The Great Pretender. But that voice, that advice is always in the back of my head, start writing. But the problem was with The Great Pretender was I didn't know what story I was telling, because as it started to unravel, and as I started to realize that this was, I was going to be in the book, because I originally wasn't going to be in the book at all, and that it was turning into an investigation, it was changing the way I was writing things. But since I had started writing some of it in the beginning, before I realized that David Rosenhan was an unreliable narrator, it actually helped me, because I was able to kind of use that for the beginning part of the book when the reader too does not know that they're dealing with an unreliable narrator. So, you know, my advice in these situations is to start writing once you have material enough to really kind of start. But the problem is, you know, you can always make a case for, well, I have to research more. I have to do a little bit more here. I have to do a little bit more there. But what I keep finding is that the more I put it off, the more research I actually have to do on the other side when I'm editing, because you only really figure out how much research you have to do when you start writing. You figure out your holes when you're writing. So my advice, and one that I don't take a lot, is to start writing as soon as you possibly can.
There's a side to that I would like to emphasize for students, which is editing and revising is hard work.
Yes.
And we as faculty often find that students really don't want to do that revising and editing. If you write before you're finished, you better be prepared for an incredible amount of revising and editing. I mean, after all, what you had planned was committed, and what you ended up with was The Great Pretender. I mean, that's a remarkable shift.
I'm a multi draft editor. And actually my love of editing, I love editing, and I love editors. And I think that love actually started at WashU because they're writing. They had I know you still do. You have kind of I don't know what you would call it, like a writing service where you can actually go somewhere and get edited by a
Writing Center, yeah.
Writing Center, yeah. And I think, I can't remember his name, but I think he still works there. He's a fantastic editor who works in the Writing Center. I think he's been there for a long time. And it was so great. I love talking shop. I love talking about writing, and that love has continued today. And I love being edited. I think partially that came from, I am insecure about writing, and any help I can get, I'll take. Also, the Post beats any ego out of you. Like, they basically are very, they don't soft pedal their criticism. So I got very used to being critiqued in terms of my editing. So I'd rather be edited and catch it before it goes to publication than get hit on the other side. So I'm a huge proponent of editing as much as you can and get as much help as you can. There's nothing that you should be ashamed about in having an editor at any level in your writing career look at your stuff.
There's Peggy Kalholtz asks a bit more, maybe consider it a bit more technical, about the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, which is now in a new version, DSM-5. And she mentions that recent versions of the DSM have eliminated the multi-axial system of earlier versions. Axis 3 was physical conditions. And now she asks, would ruling out the physical before jumping to mental disorders, would that have been a help in your experience?
I think that you could say that they were doing that. They were in the process of doing that, to be fair, because these were rule-out diagnoses that I received. I received rule-out diagnoses of bipolar 1, rule-out diagnoses of schizoaffective disorder, which means that they were in a process of ruling out everything else to finally get to that diagnosis. So it wasn't a definitive diagnosis, though I was placed on antipsychotic medication. So I think that what we were seeing was in real time, that process of trying to rule out, quote, physical. I mean, I hate the arbitrary physical psychiatric, because I think they're false dichotomies, but there was that movement to trying to figure out any other answer. So I think you have hit on something that was actually in the process of happening at the time.
I don't know if you want to mention this, but WashU played a major role in revolutionizing the DSM.
The finer criteria greatly influenced Robert Spitzer in the creation of the DSM-3, which is the Bible of psychiatry. It's the DSM we think of today. The DSM 1 and 2 were psychoanalytic. They had more psychoanalytic approaches. So the finer criteria, and especially its take on schizophrenia, probably, it would have, there was a lot of belief. Spitzer believed that if they were using the finer criteria or the DSM-3 criteria, that Rosenhan and his pseudo patients would not have fooled the doctors. That's what Spitzer believed at the time. And I can tell.
I want to spend a lot of time talking with you.
I know Len will have something to say about that, because I also don't know if that's actually true. But
another question from Beth Miller is what's a good way or the best way to, for someone who is writing a memoir? What's the best way to sort of get started trying to get a publisher, trying to get someone to read it and deal with it?
Happy to talk. I love talking shop. My first thing that I would do is find an agent. That's the number one thing that you have to do. You can't navigate these worlds unless you self-publish, which is always an option now too, and a more viable option than ever. But you want to find the agent if you want to go to traditional publishing path. And to do that, you have to find books that captured a similar audience than that you believe your book will. And don't go for like, oh, I'm going to go for the Glass Castles agent, because that agent's not going to take you. It's not going to take anyone. You go find books that maybe aren't massive bestsellers, but did well, and that you think have the audience potential that the audience that you think your book could have the potential to have. And then you write targeted emails to those agents. It's what I did to get my agent, and I wrote to 5 agents And the agent that I ended up going with wrote me back and actually his wife had unexplained seizures. So there was an affinity there. And all you have to do, and this is something that actually that agent had said to me, and I think is very smart, is you don't have to get every person at the dance to dance with you. You have to get the right partner. You don't have to get every partner to love you, just get the right partner. And that's very, very true with agents. So what you want to do is maybe get a list of 5 to 10, maybe even more books that you think capture a similar audience, and then just cold email their agents and see who's interested. But be ready to have an elevator pitch for your book, which is, a paragraph.
I'm hopeful you'll have a chance to read a lot of the messages in the chat. There's some lovely, lovely comments being made by people.
Wonderful.
I would like you to be able to read it. And here's a question from Amy, and pardon me, Amy, if I mispronounce your name. I think it's Nitzel, who's a staff member who loves writing and is completing her degree in English through our university college, and who enjoyed Brain on Fire, and is curious. Do you find it harder in writing, actually harder, not what you prefer, in writing fiction or nonfiction? What are your views there?
I don't do fiction because it's too hard. So from my perspective, fiction's far harder. And I think it's person to person, but I think writing is just really hard. And it is for me. I think Philip Roth says that his first drafts are worse than anyone else's first drafts, and he's all about the rewriting process, and he finds writing very difficult. So even at the top levels of, top writers typically find writing very, very difficult. And there's actually a great book I highly recommend if anyone is working on a book or on a paper and just wants some comfort. It's Stephen Cokes. He was the head of the Columbia Writing Department. It's called, I think it's called the Modern Libraries Guide to Writing or something. Modern Libraries Writing Workshop. It's a green cover, and it goes through all these famous writers' approaches, and it talks about drafting. And some people are first draft writers, like Flaubert was a first draft writer. He would spend a day on a sentence, but that sentence would be perfect, and by the time he was done with the book, every sentence was perfect, and he wouldn't have to go back and edit. Now, then you have Philip Roth, who had like 20 drafts for every book. So you have all these different approaches, and it's a kind of a wonderful, comforting book to look at if you are in this process and you are, grappling with how hard it is to write. Like, you can know that everyone finds it very hard to write, I think.
I'd also recommend reading word by word. I think that's.
Oh yeah. Bird by bird? Is bird by bird? Oh, sorry. Word by word. I read aloud. Reading aloud is really helpful to me because you only catch anything that kind of catches on the ear and that doesn't sound right. I read aloud The Great Pretender to poor Stephen and Brain on Fire to Stephen. I read them both aloud to him. So he's. Yes.
Oh, cool. We really do have to wrap this up, and there's so many wonderful questions yet. There's one said, well, what was your impression of Michael Devlin? Could you say that in like 10 seconds? I find that an interesting question also.
A very sad, lonely and creepy person, honestly. I mean, it wasn't very compelling, I would say. He wasn't.
Okay. Well, thank you, Susannah. I mean, I can't thank you enough for spending this time. I know you have twins. I know finding any free time is an issue. And of course, send them my love, though they don't know who the hell I am.
And Len has a new granddaughter who is so beautiful, or his first granddaughter who is so beautiful. So please send my love. I'm going to see her tomorrow. So
now your kids and her are their third cousins. That's really cool. I mean, this discussion could have gone on for hours, and special that it could focus on all different aspects, on writing, on journalism, on fiction, on nonfiction, on philosophy, on pseudo-patience. I mean, there's just so many aspects to deal with. I had a wonderful time. I just hope the people out there had somewhat as good a time as
A fraction of a good time that we did.
So to all of you who joined us, we hope you enjoyed this conversation and will participate in the next Power of Arts and Sciences events. Tomorrow's events include a seminar on charitable giving called Planning an Act of Kindness. And there also will be a panel event called Being First, what it means to be first in your family to earn a college degree. If you didn't register, we just placed a link in the chat where you can RSVP and be able to be part of those webinars. Again, on behalf of Arts and Sciences, thank you so much, Susannah, for a delightful and I hope for many inspiring conversation. We obviously couldn't be more proud of all that you have accomplished since graduating from WashU. So thank you again, and thank everyone for tuning in. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.